Hi, welcome. It was little while after I'd finished my coach training, and I went to meet a friend for coffee in the town where I live, in a local coffee shop. And I was full of the joys of coaching. I was just so happy about starting my business. And I remember she listened for a while, and then she asked me this crucial question. And this question kind of really stopped me in my tracks, because she said to me, Lisa, so tell me, why would someone hire you? Why would they hire you when they could go to, I don't know, these coaching companies, the people who have PhDs, people who are psychologists who've turned to coaching, people with a big background in kind of taking care of people in transition? Like, why would they go to you? And I immediately started answering the question. And here's the thing, I did what we often do when we're not quite sure how to answer a question. So I started talking, and then I said another sentence and another sentence and another sentence, and kind of trying to qualify what I was saying, until I wound it down and realized a couple of minutes later, I had no idea why anybody would hire me. And the truth is, I didn't have a good story to tell. I didn't have a story to tell that would be compelling to people who potentially might hire me. And that made me literally stop in my tracks and re-examine, like, what am I doing and how am I actually going to start this business? So welcome to the Story Advantage. And this is all about unleashing your story power. My name is Lisa Bloom. I'm the story coach, and I'm thrilled to be here. I have a beautiful past with the ICF, been at many conferences, spoken at many conferences, and I'm just delighted at the opportunity to speak to you today. So let's dig in. What we're going to talk about is, the story advantage. People say, well, what is the story advantage? It is the power to engage, to inspire, and to influence, and specifically for coaching and around a coaching business. So let's dig into what we're going to cover. I want to help you understand the power of story. We're also going to look at what is the relevance and opportunity for business, and particularly for coaching business. And then we're going to look at the common challenges and how to overcome them. I've got a lot I want to share with you today. So there's going to be a lot of information. Hold tight, and I'm going to just dig right in. So storytelling, when people say to me, what do you do? And I say, I'm a storyteller. They usually say, oh, how lovely, you work with children. And I always answer, no, I never work with children, very rarely work with children. But, and I work with adults, and that creates a curiosity around, well, what is storytelling for adults and how does it apply to business? But the truth is, storytelling, I certainly did not create it. It's an age-old part of culture, part of how we have communicated since the beginning of time, whether it was around the fireplace, whether it was washing clothes in the river, whether it was in the marketplace. Storytelling is the way we have communicated, interacted with, the way we have shared our day and our experience. And more importantly, it's how we have passed on the ways of the tribe, the culture that we come from, to the next generation. In fact, people have always identified with, the story basically helps them understand who they are in the world and what part they play. And I don't believe that has changed since then, just that some of the stories have changed and some of the ways in which we share stories have changed. But I noticed from the beginning of my time as a professional storyteller, and then later as I began to merge storytelling and coaching, I noticed that that storytelling is just incredibly powerful. From the very first time I stood on a stage and I told my very first story, I remember just noticing, you could hear the proverbial pin drop. People were fully engaged. People were listening in a way I almost didn't expect. And I began to think, gosh, this is a very powerful thing. And what would happen if we apply this to business? And that's exactly what I did. So over the years, I've worked in organizations and I've worked with coaches across the globe. I've been really fortunate to work in probably 15 different more. Actually, I think I got to 20 different countries across the globe, sometimes virtually, certainly recently virtually, but also in person. And it's been such an honor to do so. What I discovered is that everybody, whatever culture, whatever language, whatever profession, people relate to storytelling, and they relate to stories, and they can understand the power of story because we feel it. And so I want to dig in today to, well, what is the power of story? How does it work, and how is that specifically applicable to you in your business, in your coaching business? And also to give you some very specific tips around what are the things you can get started with. So, I love this quote from the Dalai Lama: "The planet does not need more successful people. The planet desperately needs more peacemakers, healers, restorers, storytellers, and lovers of all kinds." The only thing missing from that quote is coaches. I believe coaches are part of that, because we are peacemakers, we're healers, we're restorers, and we're storytellers. And I guess we're lovers too. I mean, that's very much a part of who we are and what we do. And so I love thinking about that in terms of kind of storytelling in the big picture. But what I became fascinated with was, as I noticed the power of stories, I noticed the way people listened when I told stories, as I began to notice how people in business were using or sometimes not using stories, I became really interested in, well, how does that apply to business? And how does it apply to the kind of businesses we're running now, the businesses online, the businesses where people are very comfortable with statistics, with all kinds of ideas and information, and very often the emotional side, the more I guess, compelling and engaging side gets put to the side as something soft, as something, the soft skills are not serious skills. And I really believe we need a revolution in that. We need to change that around entirely. So I'm going to give you some ideas of how to do that and why it's so important. So if we look at the challenges that people face as they start a business or as they develop their business, and this is so true of coaches. I mean, I think coaches in particular. In fact, my experience was going to conferences, particularly the ICF conferences years back. And I'm talking, I think my first ICF conference was in 2010. And I remember talking to a lot of people and asking them, what do you do? And people would struggle to articulate it beyond saying, well, I'm a coach. And I think, okay, but that doesn't tell me anything. And it certainly doesn't differentiate you from everybody else, the other 1,400 people in the room, right? So I think we struggle, particularly as coaches, but also in business in general, and even in organizations and roles that we have, we struggle to articulate, well, what is it that we do and how do we differentiate ourselves from other people who do something similar? I mean, whatever your niche is in coaching, you're going to find many, many other people who do that too. When I started out in storytelling and in storytelling in organizations, and we're talking, 15 years ago, there really wasn't much of that around. So I was pretty differentiated. People had no idea what it was. I had to educate people to what it was. But pretty quickly, people started talking about storytelling and storytelling in organizations. And now so many people do it. And so even if you're in a particularly niched area where there aren't a lot of people doing it, if it's viable and if it makes sense from a business perspective, it's going to become more crowded. So you still have to learn how to differentiate, articulate yourself so that you're compelling to others. And I think it's not just about being relevant, right? So it's not just, okay, here's what I am, but how am I relevant to you? It's also about, I believe we're at the point where we need to go beyond relevance and actually go to inspiration. We need to inspire people to take action, inspire people to sign up for that thing we do, inspire people to want to transition and transform what's going on in their lives or their business, depending on what you're offering. And so I kind of aim for the high bar. It's not enough to be able to say what you do. It's not enough to have that statement, and people talk about this a lot, which is, I serve this client who is struggling with this problem by doing this thing, the outcome. That's not enough. We have to inspire people. We have to tell an inspiring story, of course. And so when we think about storytelling, and when I say, you got to tell a story, you got to tell a good story, people often say, well, what is my story? And what, I have a big story, and what story do I tell? And anyway, who cares about my story? Isn't it just egoistical of me to try and tell people my story? What do they care? And I maintain again and again that people are interested in story, but only if it's relevant to them. And so there's a lot of people out there who'll talk about, you need to create a story, like the one story, the one story of you. And I believe that we have many, many stories. So it's about learning the skill and the art of storytelling, really getting that story advantage so that you can tell the right story at the right time to the right people to have the optimal effect that you're trying to create for them. And so these are some of the challenges people face. And I really feel very strongly that it's important to break it down. It's important to understand how do stories work and what are the things I can do to really kind of hone in and channel that power that's within me. And it's within every one of us. I think we're all storytellers. And again, people have come to me through the years and they've said, I'm just not a great storyteller. I don't know how to tell a story. And then I listen to them speak and I realize they're telling stories all the time. They're just not able to hone in on it and maybe work on, the crafting piece or work on their own confidence in their ability to tell a story. But we're all doing it. So there's immense potential. You don't have to be a chosen, a person born with this amazing talent. You don't have to have, years and years and years of training, although that does help. But we all have the potential to become great storytellers. And I've seen it over the years when I've worked with coaches and I've worked in organizations and I've worked with people who typically would define themselves as people who don't know how to tell a story or aren't good storytellers. And I've seen them just grow and expand into their ability and into their confidence. And it's just beautiful. It's just amazing. So I want to talk about the differentiation between what usually happens versus what I'd like to happen and what I know happens through story. And so I talk about it as kind of the before and after, or what I like to call the informational approach versus the storytelling approach. So the informational approach, many of you will be super familiar with this. The informational approach is what we're most comfortable with. It's why in organizations, for example, people create these beautiful decks, these PowerPoint presentations that have tons and tons of information. It's why when I talk to people about their presentations and I say to them, what's the message? And they'll say, oh, well, we've got about 15 messages and that's just on one slide. So the informational approach helps us feel confident because, there's lots of data, there's lots of information. And we believe in some level, I think many times it's what the educational system tells us, which is the more information you have, the more knowledge and understanding you have, the more equipped you are to make decisions, or the more able you are or ready you are for the next thing. And so we rely upon the particular design of something, or we rely on the credentials, or we look at, in projects, we look at the objectives and we create these predictive outcomes. It's all very dry. And don't get me wrong, there's a place for information, of course. I mean, we all love information and we grow and learn from information, but it's not part of our decision making as much as the storytelling approach. Why? Because it's based on human experience. It's based on the emotional shifts that happen. It's based on being able to see certain results. It's observable, and also the impact that it has on real people. So you think about any major decision you've made, for example, a purchase decision. Anytime you've bought something that you love, you've bought something that you're passionate about, usually there was an interesting story that got you either to the store, or the person and the story they told drew you in, and the opposite too. I went to a store recently, and just by the way the person was interacting with me, I knew that even though I liked some of the clothing there, I wasn't even going to try stuff on. Like, I just wasn't even willing to try stuff on, because there was something about the mannerisms, the interaction, the story that she was telling me that just completely alienated me. And the same is true of the opposite, meaning, if I think of any major decisions that I've made in life, oftentimes there were people involved. 9 times out of 10, there was somebody involved that told a compelling story that drew me to the next step in the decision. And I've seen it in my own business throughout the years. The more I leaned into this art of storytelling, the more I saw the incredible persuasive effect, the kind of influence I could have on people, the kind of way I could bring people to help them see what was possible for themselves. Super, super exciting. I love this particular slide because it reminds me of an ICF conference I spoke at in Venice in Italy, and the most incredible, it was like the most incredible venue, one of the most incredible venues I've ever spoken in. And these were the wonderful ICF Italian chapter members in the audience here. And the reason reason I share this picture is because, as you can see, there was a phenomenal amount of engagement in the audience. And I had just been telling a story, and I raised my hand and said, so how many people can relate to this? And everybody was kind of smiling, engaged, looking at me, and really wanting to get involved. And so I think one of, the first of the incredible outcomes that storytelling delivers is this level of engagement that you find quite rare. And so when we started this presentation today, I love helping you look kind of behind you or kind of under the bonnet, right? To look at how this thing works. If you notice, when I started the presentation today, I didn't say good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I didn't say hello, my name is Lisa Bloom and this is who I am. I said, so we went for coffee. I drew you into a story. Why did I do that? Because I knew it would help you become more engaged. So I believe that the outcome that storytelling delivers, first and foremost, is engagement. People get super engaged in what you have to say if you're telling a powerful story. Secondly, they get inspired by it. Like when you can hear a story that's relevant to you, then you're inspired often by the protagonist in the story. You can relate to that protagonist in some way, or the journey that's going on in the story is a journey that you're going on as well, and you can relate to that. And ultimately, when you feel inspired, when you feel engaged, the ability to influence people, and I don't mean manipulate, I mean influence them to from a coaching context, oftentimes what we're looking to do is influence people to believe in themselves, influence them to understand that this is an opportunity for them to really take a step in the direction of their own kind of their own goals, of getting to what they're here for. And so the more we can tell these powerful stories, the more we're having these incredible effects on people. But what it comes down to, because, engage, inspire, influence, it sounds a little bit kind of high level. It comes down to three things that are very, they're almost like the why do we engage? Why do we inspire? Why do we influence? Because of three things that live underneath that. The first is connection. So when you hear a story that you can relate to, you don't just connect to the story, you connect to the storyteller, you connect to other people who are hearing the story at the same time. And this isn't just what I've observed in the last 20 years or so of telling stories, both as a performing traditional storyteller, but also and particularly in business and in speaking and working with audiences, as I said, thousands and thousands of people. It's not just that I've observed this, but there's also a lot of neuroscience that proves this, that our brain is actually wired for story, that there are all these processes going on in our brain as we listen to story that helps us connect to each other, to the story, to the storyteller. And so when we feel that connection, we're much more likely to be open to whatever's coming next. And I always feel that the sign of a great story or a great storytelling is when it's not when the storyteller is, incredibly inspiring and we see this kind of hero on the stage. It's more, I see it from the perspective of the listener, the person who hears the story feels and they relate to it. It feels like you see something, you discover something in yourself that you haven't quite noticed before or you've forgotten. And when that happens through the telling of the story, suddenly you feel connected, you feel deeply connected to the story, the storyteller, the people around you who are also listening. But in addition to that, what it does is it actually inspires trust. I love to say once upon a time, we could trust so much more than we can nowadays. We could trust in our personal safety, and we could trust in the health system, and we could trust in the government, and we could trust in the banks and the church, and you name it. And nowadays, I think, certainly over the last decade or two, a lot of what we took for granted in our ability to trust has kind of faded away. It's kind of fallen apart. But when you hear an authentic story, and authentic is an important word here. So this isn't a story that I create in order to make you behave a certain way, but this is a story that I'm telling from my experience, from my heart, from my soul, a story that really opens up to share something in service of the audience. When you hear that kind of story, it instills trust. And that is one of the most important commodities nowadays in business, is the ability to create trust. And it's almost instantaneous. And it's based on the idea that or is based on the fact actually that you can't actually fake authenticity. If somebody's telling a story and either they're not connected to the story, they don't believe in the story, or what I hear often is it's a story that happened so long ago that it's become rote. It's just not even alive in them anymore. Then you don't feel an awful lot. But when you feel this authentic showing up, this presence in the storytelling, and it relates to you and it helps you to discover that thing inside you, you feel trust. And that is, again, the most important thing to enable people to make that next step and to perhaps invest in you or in your program as you build your business. And then the third thing that is inherent to the experience of story is, I believe, transformation. Now, I know that the word transformation is branded around from, all the time, and some people are very tired of it. I'm a strong believer in the word transformation. I'm a strong believer in the goal of transformation in coaching and in business. And story is by its very nature a transformation, meaning there's a start, something happens, and the outcome is different. If it wasn't, it wouldn't be an interesting story. And we're going to dig into some of how you do that in a few minutes. But the story by its very nature is a transformation, and coaching by its very nature is transformation. And that's why it's so natural to merge storytelling and coaching, both in terms of how we coach, but also in terms of how we build our business and talk about coaching moving forward. So let's talk a little bit about how does that look in our business? Because again, I always want to come back to the kind of business we're running. And for many of us, especially now during and post-pandemic, we're running our businesses online. And so how does storytelling work with that? Well, there's still speaking going on, clearly. I mean, we're all in different countries right now. Unfortunately, we couldn't be gathered together in person. Such a shame, but hopefully next time. And nevertheless, you can hear my story. You can hear each other's stories as we connect, online. But also as we create our businesses, whether it's through our social media showing up or whether it's through our website, our services or offers, story can be instilled in every single part of it. And as we tell these powerful stories, whether they're in written form or in vocal form or whether they're in visual form, what we're doing is we're creating that connection. We're creating that trust. We're creating that transformative experience. So don't think that this is just, that's a speaking skill. You've got to be up on a stage in order to use storytelling. Quite the opposite. It is a skill for pretty much every part of the business. And so oftentimes when I work with people, we talk about, well, how do you make your about page more story filled? How do you make the offers, the things that you create around your programs? How do you actually deliver your work using story as a powerful modality for engaging, inspiring, and influencing? And so it really goes across the board. And most importantly, I think it's a tool to actually help you find your voice, right? So people talk a lot about finding your voice, and you can look at that from a very practical perspective, meaning, I work on my voice. As a storyteller, you have to work on your voice. There are exercises, you can strengthen your voice. You think of tonality, you think of all that stuff, and volume and so on. But I'm talking about finding your inner voice. And as you begin to tell your stories, that by its very nature differentiates you, because your voice, your story is different to everybody else. So even if you have the same qualifications, the same time experience, that you're from the same town, you're from the same place, the story you tell is going to be different, but your particular type of experience, your particular perspective, as you articulate it through your stories, are going to differentiate you. And when you start to tell stories, you begin to feel so much more confident. I remember going back many years, when I would have the opportunity to either speak to somebody about coaching or about doing some work in an organization, and I would be invited to a meeting, I remember I would spend hours trying to research and try and understand everything about the company or the individual, everything about what they wanted, and then think about how was I going to show up to sound exactly like what they were looking for. And it was very nerve-wracking, very stressful. And I remember just not enjoying the process at all. And then years later, after I discovered the power of story in business and began to use all these kind of techniques and all these approaches, I remember there was one particular time that really struck me. It was late at night. I just finished doing some online work, And I got a message from a local forum saying that somebody was looking for a particular type of workshop. And I immediately wrote back, I was just finishing off my last cup of tea of the day. And I immediately wrote back and I said, oh, this sounds really interesting. This is who I am. And the woman immediately returned back to me and said, where are you based? When I told her, she said, oh my goodness, we're going to be in your town tomorrow. Can we meet for coffee? So I said, sure. We go to actually a different coffee shop this time. You think I spend my whole life in coffee shops. Anyway, we go to this different coffee shop and I meet with 3 of the directors of this particular program in this particular company. I didn't do any particular or not much research. I mean, I finished my cup of tea and I went to bed. I got up the next morning and I did a quick Google search to see a little bit about the organization. But I went to this meeting with the ability to simply tell my story. So when they said, so tell us about you, I could go into a relevant, kind of repertoire of stories that would draw them into the experience. And by the end of the meeting, they didn't even want a contract. They were like, okay, when can you start? Can you start on Friday? Like they were just absolutely ready for it. And I've used this tactic again and again. It's completely different in terms of stress because I feel relaxed. I go into this kind of prospecting meeting. And I know that if I'm listening carefully and I'm telling the story that's relevant to them, either they're going to love it and hire me or they're not going to hire me. And I know now that if they don't love the story, chances are I can't be what they need because I'm showing up in my most authentic and most kind of available and ready and open. And sometimes a little vulnerable, and the ability to say, yeah, I'm kind of nervous, but here's what I think. And I've had this happen again and again, the ability to be able to express my voice in story and have this incredible reaction and make it almost stress-free. I mean, I won't say completely, but almost stress-free. That's a real gift to you and to your business. And so let's talk about some of the basics of how to do this. So, 3 ways essentially to get started. The first is to think about what I call the pivotal moment. So the pivotal moment is, and this is 3 ways to get started around creating the right stories that are going to have this impact. Remember I said the right story to the right audience with the right message at the right time, right? So we start with recognizing that stories at their very base are really the recounting of a pivotal moment. And what is a pivotal moment? Something shifts. It's like this single moment in time. And by the way, story is always a single moment in time when it's really broken down to its base. It's a single moment in time where something it's like you're not quite the same person after as you were before because something has shifted. And it's usually around the interaction of people, either through a conversation or through seeing something, noticing something happening, and then something in us shifts, and it's usually an emotional shift. And as I'm saying this, you're probably thinking about moments coming up, moments in time where something shifted. When I remember when the 3rd person in my life, I had just come out of corporate, and the 3rd person in my life said to me, you should be a coach. This is after 2 other people had said, you should be a coach. And I noticed my reaction. My reaction initially was, I don't know. Is coaching really a thing? Like it was way back when I was very much on the corporate ladder, but I'd left corporate and I was trying to figure out what to do next. And I thought to myself, well, hang on a sec. If 3 people have said this, I should explore this a little further. And that was the moment. I remember where I was. I was with a particular friend. We were in her house. We were having a chat. I was telling her about my kind of thoughts around where my career was going next. I had some kids. That's why I left corporate and I was trying to figure out what's next. I remember that single moment where she said, you should be a coach. And I said, really? And she said, yeah, think about it. I mean, you've been coaching me for years. Now, some of you may recognize this because maybe that's how you got to coaching too. So there are these single moments in time. And as a result of that shift that happens, that transformation that happens in that single moment, we go on a different path. And that's one of the stories that we can tell, and one of the many stories. And pivotal moments are not just these big events, the birth, death, divorce, marriage, moving countries, moving jobs, changing careers. They're the big pivotal events. But I'm talking about the single moments where something happens and everything just suddenly looks different. And when we share those moments, they are so relatable that they suddenly have this incredible impact on others. Now, I want to also talk about another way to get to think about this idea of storytelling, and that is that, there is this, what I call a magic triangle. And I love this picture because it's not a steady, firm triangle, but it's actually something that moves and shapes around the three corners. And the three corners are the story, the storyteller, and the story listener. Because what happens is that you can tell one story to one audience, and it's going to be quite different to the story you tell to a different audience. And the story will change. Sometimes the audience changes. Sometimes how you show up as a storyteller changes. But there's this beautiful relationship where you can take a story, you can tell it in different contexts, and it has a different impact on the audience. So start thinking about what are these things that are going to be relevant to your audience that have happened to you, and how can you really serve that audience by sharing that experience. That's the thinking, the kind of positioning and thinking behind how you use storytelling. And the third thing I want to talk about in terms of getting started is, of course, the audience. So we cannot tell stories in isolation. I mean, we can, but they're just not interesting. And you've all experienced this, by the way. You've all experienced people telling stories without real connection to the audience. And you kind of thinking, maybe initially it's kind of interesting, but then they go on too long, or then you kind of miss the point, or then they're talking about something that just doesn't feel particularly relevant for you. And so it's really, really important as somebody who wants to start to tell stories to think about, well, who is my audience and what's going to be relevant for them? And why am I telling this story? Why do I want to even tell this story? How am I going to have that impact with them? And what are the critical things that are going to make a difference in the way I tell this story and make a difference to the audience? So, still got a lot more to get through. I hope you're with me and taking lots of notes. The 4 core stories. There's 4 core stories, and then there's a repertoire. So let's talk about quickly the 4 core stories. Number 1, the story they tell about you. Some people think, well, what influence do I have on the story they tell about you? Well, you have lots of influence on the story they tell about you. And that's often, it's very surface level. It's like, how do you hold yourself? How do you bring yourself to situations? Are you enthusiastic? Do you hold your back straight? Are you friendly? Are you interactive? Are you positive? Right? These are all the things that influence how, what people will say about you. How do you show up in the world? And we absolutely have influence on how we show up in the world. And that has complete influence on the story people tell about you. The second story is the story you tell yourself. And this is a big one, our inner story. So you can go into a room and you can, show up in a big flamboyant way. But if in the inside you're feeling like, they're going to figure out that I don't know what I'm talking about, that imposter syndrome, or I don't know if I believe this. I don't know if I really want to be here. I don't really like, I don't believe and all, by the way, the story you tell yourself is oftentimes a story that you don't have any permission to tell because it belongs to someone else. It belongs to that school teacher that bullied you when you were a kid, or it belongs to that parent or grandparent who didn't believe in you, or that person who disappointed. Like, they're the stories that often we tell ourselves. They don't even belong to us. There should be we should be, there should be IP rules about what stories we can tell, right, to ourselves. So really being conscious of what's the story I'm telling myself in this situation, and especially when it comes to business and how do we build our business. So people, shy away from offering prices that are realistic for the service they're offering because they're thinking, oh, I don't know if they can afford it. I don't know if I'm worth it. Am I really worth charging this much? There's a lot of work we can do on the story we tell ourselves. This is a big part of the story coaching world. Then the third core story is the story you tell them. So how do you tell your story? How do you come across as you speak to people? How do you tell your story on your website and through your services? How do you tell your story in the social media? That's a lot of what we've been talking about, is to tell your story out. And then finally, the story you are. And the story you are, this is beautiful. The story you are is really how you keep your word to yourself, right? So who are you when you strip everything away? Are you a person that is, loving, caring, generous? Are you who is that real person? If you took away all of the facades and all the masks, unfortunately, we're all very used to masks, even more the mask, external mask, but also the internal mask. So who is the story? Like, are you the kind of person that says they're going to give up smoking and then does give up smoking? Are you a person who is their word? Are you a person who walks the talk? Are you the person who gets off the stage? And this is a big one for me because I've done so much speaking over the years. I remember actually somebody coming up to me at a conference and saying to me, I've been following you. I've been reading your blog. I've been following you for many years. And what strikes me is that you're just the same. Like, there's no difference. And to me, that was the biggest compliment I could have ever have gotten, because the story I am is, I want that to be represented in everything I do, not a pretend story, not something else that's not quite me. So I need to know who I am. I need to know what is the story of me. And so that's a big part of it. And let's talk, we're almost at the end here, but I want to talk about the kind of story repertoire that's super important. So these are the business critical stories, and there's lots of them here. There's, the origin story. There's the how it all began in your business. There's why you do what you do and how you do what you do and what do you do. Like, these are all different, very critical business stories. There's the vision story. What do you imagine? Not just for your business, but what do you imagine for the world? One of the reasons that I love working with coaches is because they always have this vision and commitment to make the world really a better place. And it's just often so moving and so beautiful. And yet many times the business vision doesn't match the world vision. And that's where I come in and help people create that powerful vision story. And we use story testimonials. They're critical for our business, and also client stories. They're different. So the testimonials are what they'll tell us. The client stories is what we tell about the kind of transformation we've gained with our clients. There's the pivotal life moments. What are the things that have happened in our lives that have made all the difference? These are incredibly important stories. For 10 years, I wrote a blog. Every Tuesday, I published a blog. And I remember when my coach said to me, if you want to create an audience, you have to write more often. You have to send out your stories. My first reaction is, my life isn't that interesting. I can't come up with a story every week. But then I began to notice the pivotal moments, the tiny things related to my kids, related to my life, related to the stories around me. And I began to find these moments, and I could write about them and I could share them, and they had meaning because they were in service of my growing audience. And so being able to use these moments is really, really powerful. And the ask is a powerful business story, meaning you can talk about yourself, you can talk about your audience, you can talk about what you do, but the ask is a story around, are you willing to believe in yourself enough to work with me? Actually asking for business is a critical business story. And it is a story because we have stories in our, this is where the story we tell ourselves gets complicated, where we hesitate from the ask in our story. It's because we're not clear internally and externally. What is the next step for this person? And so there's a lot in here around the sales story. Like, how do we successfully sell what we do? Through stories. I do a lot of work around, stories that sell. And I think it's super important to be able to put in a story, tell a story, whether it's written form or verbal form, to a person that's actually asking them for their business. It's actually saying, yes, I believe in you enough. I want to work with you. I want to share this opportunity with you. And that's a critical story. And of course, the story of failure. And, if you've been in business for a while, and even if you haven't, failure is a part of it. I heard that for years without actually failing very much. But I've had some epic fails over the years too. And the big one was launching this brand new program and expecting to get 30 people signing up and having a whole financial trajectory ready based on that, hiring people, doing lots of work, launching the program and having 3 people sign up, one of whom was invited and for free. And literally just falling apart with the thought of, I just can't do this anymore. This is just too hard. And really, really struggling to figure out, how do I make this business viable? How do I continue to, I as the primary earner in my family, like, how do I continue to put food on the table? How do I continue to pay my mortgage? And so the stories of failure are important because it makes you real. It makes you credible. It makes you show up in a way that is, that feels relatable. That, again, going back to connection, going back to trust, going back to transformation. Because at the end of the day, when you can tell these stories powerfully, you have the story advantage. You have the ability to engage, inspire, and influence. And that's really what it's all about. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've taken a few things away with you. I want to thank you for being here and spending this time. I also want to offer you an opportunity to listen to the audio of my book. It just came out earlier in the year, The Story Advantage. You can go there through story-coach.com/story-advantage-toolkit, and you can download for free the entire audio of the book, in addition to other stuff, like there's other materials there as a gift. I'm so happy you've been here. If you want to reach out with any questions, you can contact me at lisa@story-coach.com. Thank you so much.